Hi everyone, we're today here with Fiona Nzingo Odvar. She is my friend of mine from Bursa Uludağ University. We took courses together in master's class. So Fiona, welcome. We're so happy to have you here today with us. And could you please introduce yourself to our audience?
Great, thank you, Alif. Izgi. My name is Fiona Nzingo. I am a master's student from Uludağ University. I studied international relations with a focus on peace and conflict studies, both for my undergraduate and my master's education. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Then let's start with our first question then, if you would like to, Fiona.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Today we're going to talk about post-colonial feminism with Fiona, as Fiona is comes from Kenya. So Fiona, what is post-colonial feminism? What are its key concepts and approaches?
Okay, so post-colonial feminism is a form of feminism that developed as a response to feminism focusing solely on the experience of women in the Western culture. So it focused on incorporating the idea of other feminists, specifically from the Western world, as opposed to thinking how the colonized woman had her own struggles with feminism. I would say that post-colonial feminism unites post-colonial theory with feminism by also bringing in the race theory, because race also plays a prominent role in colonial ideologies, which is, I would say, to some extent ignored in the overall feminist perspective. I would say that with the normal feminism, the overall feminism, it focuses mostly on the normalization of the white Western woman as the main aspect of feminist struggles. So when I talk about the overall feminism, in this term, I would say white feminism, and I hope I don't sound racist, but this is just the proper understanding of where I come from when I differentiated from post-colonial feminism. So there are post-colonial feminists like Gayatri Spivak, who suggest that liberal feminists and others under this spectrum of overall feminism have ignored the opinions of women in the global South and tend to speak on their behalf. So with white feminism, quote unquote, again, it tells us that equality standards are fixed and look the same everywhere. The post-colonial feminism comes to oppose this train of thought, because it reminds us that while westernized feminism can advocate for equal pay, that's not the same situation women outside Europe or America, that's not the same challenge women in the global South experience. So I think I did not mention some of the key concepts. So some of the key concepts that post-colonial feminists discusses is sexism, racism, imperialism, capitalism, colonialism, of course, and how there is a high structure of patriarchy in family structures, and then also how traditional cultural practices that are harmful to women are either enforced or completely ignored without thinking of the traditional aspect behind those practices. I think I may have answered that question.
Fiona, thank you so much. I think this was a great introduction in following up to our further questions, because our second question, as we also discussed or emailed with you beforehand, we would like to ask you, how did colonialism affect African women particularly? Because you're also coming from Kenya, maybe you can also enlighten us about how things work, especially from a post-colonial feminist lens. And maybe as a follow-up question, could you maybe please tell us about pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial eras, in Africa, or maybe Kenya in particular? We wonder about that. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. So I would say how colonialism really affected the aspect of feminism in Kenya, or African women, if I could put it that way, is that before colonialism, women were members of association run by and for women. Women had that power to do what they want, when they want, how they want. They even had a final say in disputes over economies from a tribal lens to a national perspective. Okay, there were nations back then, but even in terms of how women were seen when it came to leadership making, decision making in leadership, there were no limitations. The roles played by the different genders, it was never based on man versus woman. It was based on age and also one's social status. So Africans were living in a way that men were very secure with how women advanced with their talents. They were never threatened by a powerful woman, as opposed to now, which I will explain later on. Women were politically active. Elderly women had a voice in many important issues. I'll later on give an example on how one elderly woman in Kenya really changed the lens we had towards colonialism. Women also used the production of food to gain respect, and in turn they used that respect to dominate their children and influence the men in their lives. So you could see that they had a lot of power back then. So when colonialism came in, sorry, if I could give an example for pre-colonial Kenya, how it looked like. So women, I mentioned how had this power to do anything and everything. There are two tribes that really gave women a lot of power that I could use as an example here. There were the Kamba and Nandi women who were given the right to marry other women to protect them after their husbands died, or when they discovered that they couldn't bear children. So in such a setting, for example, a woman would marry another woman and have children with a man of her choice. If I would mention that now in our Kenyan setting, that is, I would say, impossible. And again, this structures that colonialism brought really changed the shape of how women had their rights over themselves and even the freedom to do anything. So I would say when colonialism came in, colonialism developed its own legal system where women were really at a disadvantage, because these customary laws that were set up by colonialists at that time, they were really focusing on male testimony, and it gave men, especially the elite men, advantages over women in issues of marriage and divorce, for example. So women's pre-colonial political activities, the activities that I had mentioned before, were completely disregarded by colonial authorities because they focused exclusively on what the men had to say. So women lost a lot of power, a lot of property, a lot of autonomy when colonialism came in. And this in turn led to an intensification of domestic patriarchy, and colonial social institutions really made sure that these structures that were mostly patriarchal really survived and thrived under their rule. So again, aside from these powers that were stripped away from women, they were also excluded from this new political and administrative system that colonialists had formed. So you would rarely see a woman be used as an administrative chief, or a woman being consulted over what would happen in their land, which was a shame because women really thrived as leaders before then. And when Kenya became independent after 1963, you would think that a lot had changed, that Kenyans would appreciate their way of living before and go back to that way of living where women were really regarded and their opinion was consulted and cherished. But unfortunately, that was not the case. So women still continued to live in a society that had patriarchal order. So a few young women were able to just have benefits after independence, but the number that was being observed was not as high as compared to the men. So they would attain education, but again, it was very limited. I would say in the state that we are now, many Kenyan women have benefited from introduction of the overall feminist point of view, such as female consciousness, confidence in women, gender equality, and justice for women. But it's still a very slow stride that is taking place. So several challenges really limit these strides that we would work towards gender equality, such as poverty, education disparities, and also regional disparities being observed in the country. And again, even now in 2021, women in Kenya, women and adolescent girls in Kenya are considered the most vulnerable group. And I would say this goes back to how colonialism really changed and affected the structures that we are living in. But don't get me wrong, I do believe that strides are being made, but it's very slow. Yeah.
Thank you, Fiona. That was so clear. I remember a presentation you made about Mkhitaryan in during our courses in Bursa University, and I would like to ask you a question about Mkhitaryan. Could you please tell us who is she and how has she become such a significant figure in African independence struggle?
Great. I'd be happy to talk more about Mkhitaryan. First of all, I would say, I'm not going to say she's one of my favorite female heroes. First of all, because her initial name was Mnyazi Wamenza. And in my family, my mother and my niece are both called Mnyazi, so I hold that name really dear. So she was born in Kilifi, which is on the coastal side of Kenya. And the fascinating thing is she was 53 years old when colonization began. It's impressive how a woman of her age really felt the need to rise up against the colonial rule. I'm thinking if I was 53, I would not bother, because in my mind, I'm just like, I'm too old. There's nothing in life to live. But it was impressive that she really felt that level of oppression. And I think it says a lot about how colonialism really changed the way Kenyans were living. And I would say the same for other colonial states at the time. So she was one of the first women in Kenya to rise up against the British in 1913. So she wasn't in the freedom struggle scene for a long time compared to her other counterparts, but her contribution, I would say, really raised an overall African consciousness amongst both the Giriama people, where she was from, the coastal region of Kenya, and also Africa in general. So at the time, before when the colonizers came in, when she was there, the British really took advantage of the Giriama people. So they took their land to grow crops that would benefit their economy as opposed to the people of the land. They were also putting increased economic pressure on the Giriama people. They taxed them. They attempted to control the trade that they were having, and also would take their young men to work on their plantation and public work projects, which was quite unfair because this again was not something they were used to. And also other men were taken to fight for the British Army. And this really caused, I would say, a gap for the Giriama people in the region. So Mkhitaryan, how she came in, she spoke out against this harsh colonial government. She says she was really against their practices of how they took their men to labor for them, and even over taxation. So one interesting way she did this was through dancing. She did a dance called Kifudu. I have no idea how it's done. I know it was a funeral dance that was used amongst the Giriama people. So she would do this dance, and it would rally people around her. And as soon as she gathered momentum when it came to the people around her, she also tried to make sure to break down the Giriama culture and remind the people who they were and where they're from. And she also made people swear an oath to resist the British rule, for people not to take the I would say nonsense or this oppression that the British rule had brought upon them. So she gained recognition as a rebellion leader in the area just from her dance. So as she rallied more people, she contributed to the uprising the Giriama did in both 1913 and 1914. And even within this time, she was still arrested because she was recognized as a rebellious person in the community, which was a problem for the British. They really tried their best to arrest her and detain her, but every time she would escape, and she would be arrested and taken to the other side of the country and find her way back to Kilifi, which was interesting, again, keeping in mind of her age. Because she never gave up, the British ultimately relaxed control over the region, and they granted the demands for which Menza and the Giriama in general had tightly fought for. So in the end, Mkhitaryan actually gained a leadership role, and she headed a women's council. That was something which hadn't even existed even in the pre-colonial period. So she really brought in a new structure from countering this colonial structure that really favored women, and it was something to behold, because again, it was something new for the society. And she died at around the age of 70. And even after her death, whatever she did really managed to spark up feelings of a revolution against the British and against many other movements. And many other movements really heard of her story, and they started to also have an uprise towards the British people. Yeah.
Thank you, Fiona. Finally, we would like to ask you a question about our recent idea. We are trying to understand movies with theories. So, with your permission, we want to show you short scenes from a TV series called Selfmade. Would you like to interpret these scenes from the perspective of postcolonial and feminist theory? Erman, can you share?
Let's go.
I'm gonna help you. My hair grew back, and so did my confidence. Maybe I could sell your product. I don't think sales is for you. Colored women will do anything to look like me, even if deep down they know they can't.
Okay, this was the first one. Now we move on to
Sisters, let's talk about hair. They put us down, tell us we're ugly, make us feel ugly. Wonderful hair leads to wonderful opportunities.
All right. The floor is yours, Fiona.
Thank you. I had earlier warned I have so much to say about these two clips. But I will try and be very professional and hold it into the international relations spectrum. So I would say, first of all, from those perspectives, it really goes to show how for Black women and girls, the identity is really linked to the presentation of their hair and also the relationship they have with their hair. I would say a lot has not changed ever since, but I'll get more into that later on. So for that time, considering it was right after, slavery was really fresh off their minds, it was really a time where Black people were establishing their identity after slavery. And hair, even before slavery, it really had spiritual and religious connotations. And even the time when Black people were taken from their land, where they were forced as slaves at that time, it was such a big culture shock, because they had things they would use when they were in their country, when the herbs and spices or oils that they would use to take care of their hair was no longer there when they were taken back to be slaves in America. So they had to really substitute whatever they were using. And I would say this is as a response to the second clip you played. So as a substitute, they had to find things that they would use to make their hair continuously flourish. Madam C.J. Walker, as I understand at that time, was really going through a tough time with her hair, given the fact that identity of her hair was also very important, and she was losing her hair, and she tried to find a way that she could really maintain her crown, as we say it in this community, if I could put it that way. And she really wanted other women to feel pampered in the same way. And at this time, Europeans had also really changed the mindset Africans had of their hair. They were really struck by the various hairstyles they saw within each community, and in an effort to dehumanize and break that African spirit, they used to shave the heads of these enslaved Africans. I would say it wasn't a random act, but it was more of a symbolic removal of African culture. This, I would say, points out to some of the experiences that feminism in general cannot encompass. And that's why it's really important to think through how postcolonial feminism, which really details some of the things that women from the global South, or even slaves at that time, experienced that white women never experienced, or would never cover such a topic when it comes to feminism in general. So when slavery took place, I mentioned before, Europeans really tried to find a way to remove the African culture from their slaves. So Africans on the plantation either had to emulate white people or cover their heads in an effort not to offend the white people. So and this happened for 2 centuries, which was such a long time for someone to still have a strong, I would say someone to have a strong belief in what they were doing, even as Africans at the time. So within these 2 centuries, I would say they became whitewashed, and they didn't have the same old health and beauty consciousness or standards that they had as they arrived as slaves. I would say that Africans began to believe that lighter skin and straighter hair would assist them in attaining social and economic mobility. And that's why you can see from that clip where the light-skinned lady, apologies, I never got the name of all the characters. The light-skinned lady kept on saying, you can't have straight hair, you can't have hair like mine. Yes, she was Black, but even within the Black community, there were standards that where a light-skinned person would be favored by the white people as opposed to a Black person, because they were not completely Black, and they looked more white than other Black people. So I would say this era of where slaves had the freedom now to some extent, the freedom to live their lives, is when Madam C.J. Walker thrived a lot, because I think women at that time were really going through a challenge of trying to figure out how to take care of their hair, and also being able to have good hair that would give them more opportunities that, and again, it goes back to being whitewashed to thinking that way. So one interesting thing in that Madam CJ did, she also found a way to bring in a straightening comb that she fashioned in 1905. She wasn't the inventor, but this tool became more accessible to Black women who desired straight hair, which equaled opportunity. Again, another aspect that is not really covered in the overall feminist perspective. And this could only be seen in post-colonial feminism, because feminism really is seen from, I would say, back to white feminism. And I hope I don't sound racist, but this is just the terminology I would use to be able to explain that distinction. And during that time, her industry grew so much that she became the first self-made millionaires in the US. At that time, just from selling hair products. You could see the extent of which Black people really struggled to fit in because of these Eurocentric features that were favored by their masters at the time, because they really wanted an opportunity to grow. At that time also, good hair was perceived as the closest to white people's hair: long, straight, silky, bouncy, manageable, healthy, and shiny, while bad hair was short, matted, kinky, nappy, coarse, brittle, and looking like wool. So these were painful narratives that majority of the Black women grew up hearing, that their hair was too nappy or their skin was too dark, and they really tried to find a way to change all of this. But luckily, right after, there was the civil rights era where Black people really acknowledged their identity, and the Afro hairstyle emerged in the 1960s. At that time, it was more of a symbol of rebellion, pride, and empowerment. So Afro, natural hair, it continued to be a symbol of Black power. It still does to this day as well. So young Black people were tired of the oppression, and at that time, the Afro, if you wore an Afro, it kind of showed that you hated white conformity. What they told you when they were your masters, you were against it at that time. So again, this is not something that was lost in Africa, because again, I believe that the history of Black people in America compared to Africans here are two different things. We would call it racism, mostly from what they experienced in America, while we experienced colonialism. But there is a lot of similarity, which is oppression and racism as well. And yeah, I would say that is what would be the overall mindset I had as I watched those clips.
This is really exciting to hear, first of all, and it's really fascinating how you take up on those little traders. And we also would like to maybe suggest and urge our listeners or viewers, wherever they are on the platform, to see the movie series, also in Netflix in Turkey. I think it's also available. We also would like to thank you, because it wraps up our questions basically. But before we wrap up, we would like to offer you the floor once again. If you have any final words or any messages to our audience, if you would like to share, then we can conclude.
Great, I don't mind that. So I would say my final thoughts on this beautiful discussion, and thank you again for engaging me in this, is that post-colonial feminism, it draws our attention to that uncomfortable reality that colonialism really isn't over. I say the experience that women had during the time of Madam C.J. Walker is no different from what women now are experiencing. It has shown that Black hair industry is a $2.5 billion business built, I would say, on racism. For starters, because women are still struggling to conform to what is good and what is good hair and what is bad hair. A second reason is also because of how much is put into taking care of our natural hair. I wish I had my afro out. But yeah, it's not there right now. I would say a lot of money and time is invested on natural hair. I don't think that's a coincidence. I feel like it's still limited on structural racism to some extent. According to Schwartz, a hair company, that the average American would spend $89.95 on hair care products. Black women, on the other hand, $89 is nothing. I'm here in Kenya where like our money is not equals to the US structure, but women here also spend so much money on their hair. And we're really struggling to fight this notion that straight hair is good, nappy hair is bad. But we're still, I would say this is a struggle we're still trying to figure out how to get over. But yeah, it's good to keep in mind that structural racism also has economic, social, and political consequences for Black women and in general. And I would also say that postcolonial feminism reminds us that while some say exploited people should say let colonialism go because it was hundreds of years ago, the effects of colonialism and imperialism are still felt. This opens up the opportunity to create a transnational rather than international alliance, having like grassroots and different approaches towards supporting this feminist movement rather than imposing what we may believe is the path to equality. So it's also a way to look beyond the whitewashing of feminism in general and to understand that that each feminist has to be accountable for their own actions and activism. So in reality, I would say feminism is not feminism unless it's post-colonial. Thank you.
I'd like to say thank you, Fiona, for being with us here. I would like to thank you on behalf of Academicus and our audience that we had such a great, pleasant conversation with you here today about feminist theory, post-colonial feminist theory, and we talked a lot, I think. We talked about African woman, Kenyan woman, Mkhitaryan womenza, and also we talked about movies. So thank you for being with us here today.
And thank you for having me as well. I appreciate.
We can say that please follow our work as Academicus as we try to bring you all current and somehow misrepresented or underrepresented discussions, international and political science in general, but in social sciences in general. Thank you so much. Stay in touch. Bye, Fiona.
Bye.